Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Ellie Price. Coming up later, as the BBC drama series continues to captivate television audiences, we look behind the headlines at the real problem of global money laundering in the capital. Joining me for the duration of the show, the Labour MP for Ealing Central and Acton, Rupert Huck, who is the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on anti-corruption, and Bob Neal, Conservative MP for Bromley and Chislehurst, who chairs the Justice Select Committee. Welcome to you both. Now, according to a highly critical report published this week, passengers on Southern, Thameslink and Great Northern services have suffered the worst rail disruption in the UK, with Londoners and London commuters bearing the brunt. The National Audit Office said the UK's largest rail franchise, GTR, has not provided value for money. Jerry Thomas has more.
The report found that the services had been the worst on the network since Govia Thameslink took over the routes, and at worst only 2/3 of trains arrived on time. 60% of delays on the GTR network were due to industrial action or lack of crew, and nearly 40% of delays were down to poor infrastructure. The Department for Transport is being blamed for not ensuring that adequate staffing were available before awarding the franchise. The Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, responded to the criticism in the House of Commons.
What I do apologise for is that we were not able to avoid the extraordinarily ill-judged actions by the trade unions who caused massive trouble for passengers.
The report went on to say that the government should learn lessons from the case when it sets up other rail franchises in the future.
Lessons for franchises in the future. I rather think commuters would probably want action now. Bob Neal, a sort of apology there from the Transport Secretary, but the buck passes the unions. What do you think's going on, and shouldn't he and the government take a bit more responsibility?
Well, Chris was perfectly right to make the point about the behaviour of the unions, which I think was absolutely unacceptable in that case. But there are other problems too, and there is an issue, I think, with the way those franchises were drawn up to begin with. And the government does have an opportunity now to change the makeup of those franchises. I've said the same thing about South Eastern, my own franchise, Elliot, where I think it's too big. And clearly this one, where it's an enormous geographic franchise, doesn't make any sense at all. So as well as doing what the government is doing, I think they should revise the geographic spread of the franchises to make them smaller, because I don't think you can just get a grip on something that size. And the other thing I suggest we could do is split off the suburban elements of the franchise and integrate those more closely with TfL. Those would be things that you could sensibly do. OK. Rupert Huck, blame for the unions.
I mean, I think it's a cheap shot to blame the unions. I actually agree with Bob, though, that this franchise is too unwieldy. I mean, it's a Great Northern, Southern, Thameslink, bits of Gatwick Express are part of it. For one company, it is too big. I think it's 25% of all journeys covered by this franchise. They've said when it comes up again in 2021, they'll break it up. But I think rather than the unions, it's the way that we run our railways. I think it's time to put train and track together. And I'd say put the whole lot in public ownership, because it's just too unwieldy for one person. As Bob says, it covers from Peterborough down to Portsmouth, I think. It's just, you know,
because the problem is we feel like there's a blame game going on here, isn't there? The government blames the unions blame the train companies, etc. We need something done, and we need something soon. And the government's already suggested it's not going back to TfL. So what can be done?
Well, what I think you can do, I think it's a mistake that they're not putting it back with TfL, but what they have agreed to do is try and ensure much closer operational working between TfL and whoever gets a new franchise in these cases. I still think you could break up the franchises one way or the other. I think the other thing, putting train and track together, I agree with Rupert on that, and that could be done within the context of new franchise. I don't agree with bringing it back into public ownership. I commuted up when it was British Rail. I've been a London commuter for nearly 40 years, Ellie, and the myth that there was a good British rail is exactly that. It was terrible. It was absolutely awful.
I mean, we don't have to go to a 70s model. You could do a European-style public ownership.
Where I do think the reason I actually favour privatisation, Rupert, is that you ought then to if the company fails, you should take the franchise off them.
Very quick word from Rupert, and then we'll move on.
Then also Govia is a French company. They took over from Abellio, which is a Dutch company. They've sold off the depots at Willesden and Ilford to the Canadians. I mean, it just seems a bit weird that all these other foreign franchises can bid in, apart from our own government.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. We will watch the story, but plenty of options by the sound of it. Now, this week, the Mayor faced questions from the London Assembly about his draft annual budget. Londoners will be finding out just how much he's investing in the public services he funds. Bhavani Vadi has more.
It's the time of year when the Mayor's metaphorical piggy bank is opened up. He has a pot of nearly £16 billion at his disposal for the next financial year.
Sadiq Khan is currently being grilled by the London Assembly on his spending plans for the public services that he funds, such as transport, the fire service, the work of City Hall and policing. He's had time to bed into the job. This is his second annual budget, and he's decided to raise his share of council tax, unlike his predecessor Boris Johnson, who held it down.
While police spending fell under Boris Johnson, Sadiq Khan is using his council tax hike to maintain spending on police operations at around £3.3 billion.
The issue that stands out above all others in this budget is funding for the Metropolitan Police Service. Keeping Londoners safe is my top priority.
Despite this, next year there will be 2,000 fewer police officers in the capital. The Mayor has dropped the strategic target of 32,000 officers, which has been in place since 2012. He says that's due to government funding cuts in the face of increasing costs.
The government has forced the Met to make £600 million of cuts over recent years already, and the announcement on funding from the Police Minister before Christmas was just smoke and mirrors.
The Mayor, instead of taking ownership of his own actions, is far too quick to blame everybody under the sun, whether it be his predecessor, or if he can't find a reason to blame him, he'll blame the government or the man on the moon, or anybody else but himself. The Mayor has the power to move funds around the GLA group, and he has not done so. So he could have maintained police officer numbers at a high level, and he hasn't. He's putting money into the London Fire Brigade rather than the police, and they will be putting that money straight into their reserves, so they won't be spending it on operational duties at all.
Transport is the other big issue in this budget. Overall spending for transport for London will drop slightly to around £9.5 billion. And this mayoral budget has highlighted some concerning pressures on TfL finances.
So we've seen the Mayor over the last year cut some of the buses across London. We're seeing fewer buses on bus routes right across the capital. And yet his budget has a line saying we're going to get more revenue in from passengers on buses. It doesn't stack up.
TfL is expecting to receive £900 million less in money from passenger fares than was projected in the Mayor's budget just 2 years ago. And TfL's level of borrowing next year at just over £12 billion is more than its total budget. That means debt repayments of around £500 million in the next year alone.
You do need to invest in services in order to get income for the future. And one of the biggest pieces of investment that is underway at the moment is, of course, the development of Crossrail, the Elizabeth line, parts of which will start running at the end of this year. So there'll be a huge uplift in our passenger income.
This is a draft budget that's due to be finalised next month. The Mayor seems to have cross-party support from Assembly members on raising his share of council tax to fund policing. But there are questions over whether he's making the best use of the rest of the money in his piggy bank.
Well, joining us, Professor Tony Travers, leading expert in local government from the London School of Economics. Hello, Tony.
Hello.
You've seen plenty of these budgets in your time. What do you make of this one?
Well, there's definitely something, or a number of things that are new about it. We've heard about them in the film, really. One is the decision to at least not to increase police spending significantly, but to stop the reduction in police spending that's been going on for a number of years now. Police grants have been cut, not only in London, and that's left police spending lower than it was 5, 6, 8 years ago. And what we've got here is a clear signal that the Mayor's willing to push up the council tax, the precept that he sets, in order to try to stop that reduction. But it's not going to lead to a big increase in police spending, and something similar is true for the fire brigade as well.
And that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because he's obviously worked out it's palatable to lift council tax, but actually you won't see more bobbies on the beat.
I think, I mean, just not only the Mayor, in fact, in the government, they both really agreed now that council tax needs to go up in order to pay for, as I say, not a big increase in police spending, but at least to ensure it doesn't fall any further. And there is, you know, however much politicians in different parties will argue that it's each is the other's case, the truth is the government and the mayor are kind of on the same side in being willing to put up the council tax in order, as I say, not massively to increase police spending, but at least to stop it falling any more.
Rupert, let me bring you in on this. The Mayor of London has somewhat blamed central government for funding cuts, but it's been his choice to scrap the strategic target of 32,000 police officers on the beat. That's his choice, isn't it?
I mean, in the film he pointed out that there's been £600 million of savings, as they're euphemistically called. There's another 400 million coming between now and 2021. We've got a Conservative government that's very clever at displacing these cuts onto, you know, even in Ealing we see that we have fortnightly bin collections now. Nobody came into politics because they wanted to do any of that stuff, but when there's sort of everything's being stretched thinner and thinner, people are trying to do more and more with less and less, he's kind of boxed into a corner and is running out of options. That's why the precept has to be raised, which is a courageous thing to do because Boris wouldn't do it.
Bob, let me bring you in on this. Government is responsible for 70% of funding of the Met. The fact that there's been 4 terror attacks last year, it's not a good look, is it, to cut funding?
Well, in fact, the government has protected police spending as a global figure. But what has happened is, of course, is that precisely because of the terrorist threats, more spending has to go onto those counter-terrorism issues. That has made less available for what we sometimes call more territorial or local policing. But I think that just reflects the pressures that we have as a society. But just one point, it's a bit rich, I think, for the mayor to start blaming government and asking for more money from government, when if you look at his draft budget figures, there's about £50 million unallocated. So he needs to get his own budget in order. He's not a good budgeter, and to start complaining about others when he's still not actually worked out what he's going to do with £50-odd million of money doesn't give you very much confidence in the sort of approach he's adopting.
Tony, let's come back to another aspect of it then, transport. Yep. We talked there about fare revenues going down. Is that something to worry about? The Mayor of London and team keep talking about the opening of the Elizabeth line and Crossrail. Is that going to boost anything?
Well, I mean, the Elizabeth line, Crossrail, was going to open and bring in, we hope, extra fares. It'll have to do that because part of the funding for Crossrail is to be paid for by, has been paid for by borrowing, and that borrowing will now need to be serviced from here on in. But what's happened is that even before Crossrail has opened, there's been a big reduction in the yield of fares to TfL as compared with what was projected a couple of years ago, or even last year. Now, some of that will be because of the fares freeze that the Mayor introduced, but some of it is simply because passenger numbers, not only on the tube but also in buses and on the national rail system, have started to fall, and that's really an unusual thing and nobody was really predicting it.
And very briefly, what do you put that down to?
I think changing patterns of work, different people responding to the strikes that were being discussed earlier on.
The hopper bus fare, that's quite a good one, you can change.
You can, there are lots of reasons, but I think there's probably a bigger change going on in society about how people work, where they work, when they work, where they choose to live. And TfL and all of us will now have to cope with the fact that fare income may not continue to grow as it has done for many years, and that will be a challenge for TfL.
Rupert, how is TfL going to cope then?
I mean, it's true that he's kept to his promise of freezing the fares, which traditionally the Labour Party on the 1st of January does a campaign about your fares gone up. We had to differentiate in London this year.
It's only a partial freeze, though, on fares, isn't it?
It's for single fares, isn't it?
The original promise was a complete fare freeze. Of course, he couldn't possibly keep that. And
I mean, again, he's being attacked for doing that because people are saying some of these improvements won't happen. I think he's done it the right way, and it's a draft budget. Let's see what the real one.
But I mean, that fare freeze alone cost £640 million over 4 years.
But I think our constituents want that because they've seen fares go through the. I think again on the Govia story we had last, some of those routes, some of the ones to Kent, things have gone up 12% over Christmas. I mean,
I think our constituents also want to be able to get on the tube, and in consequence of this partial fare freeze, only a partial fare freeze, we've seen cancellations in other projects like the cancellation of 27 new trains on the Jubilee and Northern lines. So this is actually going back to the old Gordon Brown approach to budgeting. You just make one point, Rupert.
Yeah.
You know, you've got Sadiq and Val Shawcross saying, oh, we're borrowing to invest. Well, that's exactly what Gordon Brown did, and the fire mess that got us all into.
But
So
there
it's just not clever
used to be a
budgeting.
thing called a TfL resource grant, which again George Osborne slashed. So a lot of this, it's sort of tinkering around stuff that
budget
comes.
in order first. He'd be better placed to ask for more from others.
We're going to have to leave it there. I think we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. We do like to argue about a good old budget. Tony Travers, thank you very much for joining us. The BBC's latest hit drama series, McMafia, charts the rivalry between Eastern European organised crime factions, and London, it suggests, is right in the thick of it. Tanjil Rashid has more.
Сколько раз можно говорить? Я русский человек, ты мой сын, говори со мной по-русски.
London, at the heart of nefarious Eastern European organised crime networks. That's the picture painted by the BBC drama McMafia, in which Russian gangsters launder their money through the city's financial sector. But how accurate is it? This man was for many years at the front line in the fight against money laundering from Eastern Europe, and he says,
very simply, very accurate. It typically ends up in London indirectly, in the sense that the assets are British-based, and that's typically property through foreign-owned companies. London is the world's foreign exchange capital, and there's this huge network of asset management companies and corporate service providers, professional service, the lawyers, the accountants.
There's been increasing scrutiny of the city's role in laundering money from Eastern Europe. Last year, a Guardian investigation showed that $750 million of questionable money had passed into UK bank accounts over a 4-year period. All of the major London-based high street banks were involved.
One of the strangest causes of this situation is that rich criminals are attracted to London not because the capital is somehow lawless, but precisely for the opposite reason, because the rule of law is so strong here that they know they can count on London's authorities to protect their private property and their ill-gotten gains. And that's why they choose London as the ultimate destination to launder all their money. The question is, what are London's lawmakers going to do about it?
Well, one good measure the government could take would be to ensure that there are prosecutions of the companies which are in effect front companies that allow money to be laundered through them in the United Kingdom. The number of cases that have been prosecuted is very small indeed, and we require, I would suggest, more energy from the UK authorities to pursue those companies.
You know, in Russia they call everyone a gangster. So what? Papa was a businessman.
But McMafia's portrait of Russian gangsters at large in London is disputed by the Russian government. In a statement, the embassy told us they believe it was misleading and wrong. If anything, a Russian citizen in the UK is much less likely to be imprisoned than an average British resident.
Tanjil Rashid reporting. Well, we're joined now by the Russia expert Luke Harding, who last year in The Guardian exposed the alleged role of London's banks in laundering Russian money. Hello, Luke.
Hello.
It's a good watch, isn't it, for a Sunday night, but how accurate is it?
It's pretty good. The Russian gangsters perhaps a little bit overblown, but the underlying thesis that London, I would say, is I think the most corrupt place on the planet is true. Not because there are gangsters running around with Bob and Rupert in Westminster, but because we facilitate all this stuff. We allow it, we nod it through, our banks, our lawyers, our real estate agents, and every so often we will publish this material. We'll go and see the National Crime Agency, and they will shake their heads and say, it's a bit difficult, the perpetrators are far away, we'd like to do something, but we can't. And I think that's no sensible place to be.
So there's collusion from the Russians, from the Russian government. I know you've suggested in the past there's collusion from here in London where people are making money.
Yeah, I mean, kleptocracy is not a thing of far away. It's actually happening on our doorsteps. You just need to walk around West London and you can see it. And one thing we discovered is that it's firms registered at Companies House in London, one around the corner, which processed $9 billion, by the way, and they've got posh-sounding names. They look okay, but they're owned by mysterious entities in the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and so on. And quite often this money is going through British overseas territories. Now, the government could force these territories to publish a register of who owns what, but for reasons that escape me, they don't.
Well, let's find out, shall we? Rupert, Bob, this is so rife, even TV drama writers are making money out of it.
I think it is a consequence of London being a global city, and that brings a downside as well as an upside. I think Luke's right about that. And because it's a comparatively safe place, that's why it happens here. But the government have taken a number of measures. First of all, as far as the National Crime Agency is concerned, we've strengthened very recently the links between that and the Serious Fraud Office by having a specific National Economic Crime Unit which can task those agencies and pull them together much more effectively. Secondly, we strengthened the law to make it easier to prosecute cases of corruption where the corruption occurs abroad but the perpetrators are over here. That's an important step in the right direction. And thirdly, we have much greater transparency than most places on registers of beneficial ownership. And what we have said, we've got agreement from the overseas territories now, is that they will have central registers of ownership. And although they are not all published publicly, they do make all those details available to any law enforcement agency upon request. So that is a major step in the right direction. There's more we can always do. We have to continue to be vigilant. And I think probably we should be looking at some of those bogus companies based here and be more vigilant about that and perhaps put more resource into those issues.
Rupa, you're on the all-party parliamentary group for anti-corruption. We heard in the film there this issue of the rule of law actually protecting some of these people. Shouldn't that same rule of law actually be used to pursue them?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the programme is fiction, but I mean, there's no smoke without fire. And this kind of culture of secrecy jurisdictions, I think there's 86 million pounds of property. No, hang on, it's more than that, isn't it? Anyway, half of it is in London.
Lots of money.
Yeah, think of a number. No, but honestly, there's, 10,000 alone in the borough of Westminster where we are now, 6,000 in Kensington and Chelsea of these properties that we don't know who really owns them, because in these secrecy jurisdictions it's a company, we don't know who the individuals are, so we could have much greater transparency.
But Luke seems to know who they are.
Yeah, and with respect to Bob, it's not good enough for the overseas territories to sort of give it to the National Crime Agency, because they tell us that they're overwhelmed, and I've talked to people in the banks who say there's so much of this stuff, billions of pounds, it's like trying to play whack-a-croc. They just can't catch it. And the way to do this properly is to publish this, to shine light on these owners and to end the kind of culture of offshore secrecy that I think is kind of blighting this country. Also going through Scotland, by the way. A lot of Scottish schemes registered in Glasgow and places like that. It's not just a London problem. But David Cameron was quite keen to do something about this because his dad was in offshore, his late father. But from Theresa May, I've seen nothing.
I think well, Theresa has tried to get an international agreement, Luke, as you know, because I take your point. The problem we have with the overseas territories, all people would do at the moment, they simply move it from, say, British Virgin Islands to Delaware or one of the US jurisdictions, where there's far less transparency than anything in any of the UK jurisdictions.
It's complicated, though, but is there just a lack of political will?
I think that this Theresa May government has dragged its feet somewhat. I mean, we've got a strategy now that came out at the end of last year, but we need proper legislation. And, yeah, David Cameron, remember he did that whole summit about it, and he used to say, let sunlight be the best disinfectant, but there's been very little action.
He actually had an anti-corruption summit, but the problem was 2 months later he was out of office.
Yeah.
And you can't help but thinking that there's a sort of...
Very briefly then, Bob, enough being done?
I think you could never do enough. I think we've taken valuable and important steps. I think events that happened since David's time, sadly, from my point of view, have rather crowded out some of the political agenda, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't return to it once we've
going to have to stop you all there because we've run out of time. Thank you all for coming.